Hello once again, this is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been coming to you with a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD or Application and Web Development 1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class. So far, I have gone through many different, really about 100 different video presentations that I've created for the class. The book we're planning on using for the class, as you can see here, is Asp.NET Mvc with Entity Framework and CSS by Mr. Lee Naylor. Excellent book as far as the code. Not so excellent when it comes to the amount of explanation that's often given for the code. So I decided to try to help enhance our understanding. I would first go over several of the chapters from Professional ASP.NET MVC 5 by John Galloway and others. So far I've gone over Chapter 1, Getting Started, Chapter 2, Controllers, Chapter 3, Views, Chapter 4, Models, which brings us to Chapter 5, which is Forms and HTML Helpers. I'm going to go over 5, then 6 on data annotations and validation, then 7. 7 I'm probably not going to get into in a lot of depth and breadth of coverage. I'm not a security expert. I was fortunate enough earlier in an earlier teaching profession to work with a gentleman who was a security expert. He taught me a lot, but I still have way more to learn. But we will go over it at least somewhat. We will go over Chapter 8 on AJAX. We will go over Chapter 9 on routing. What I will not be going over in this class is Chapter 10 on NuGet, Chapter 11 on ASP.NET Web API, Chapter 12 on single-page apps with Angular, or Chapter 13 with dependency injection. I'm not going to go over those. But after I get done with the first 9 chapters, I'm going to skip down to Chapter 14, talk to you about unit testing. Then we'll go into Chapter 15, which is on extending MVC. And we'll end up with Chapter 16, which is on advanced topics. All right. I will not be going over Chapter 17, Real World ASP.NET MVC, Building the NuGet website. There's a lot of terrific stuff in this book, as there's a lot of terrific stuff in the Naylor book. But the idea is we have to be able to come to some kind of a balance between the amount of lecture we give you and the amount of time we give you for lab. So with that said, let's start on Chapter 5. So again, I'm on page 109. As you can see, Chapter 5 is entitled Forms and HTML Helpers. Our objectives: understanding forms, making HTML helpers work for you, editing and inputting helpers, displaying and rendering helpers. As always, the associated code is available in the book. And they mention here, as their name implies, HTML helpers help you work with HTML. That would make sense. All right, it says you may wonder why you would need to even use those. All right, I mean, HTML is fairly intuitive, but the hard part of working with HTML is making sure the URLs inside of the links are doing what they're supposed to be doing. All right, if you've got a query string, that the query string is correct, or if you've got something else. All right, making sure, as it says, things like form elements have the proper names and values, so they associate with the model binding router that we talked about in the last chapter. You want to make sure you display not just the errors when it fails, but appropriate errors. So as it says, tying these together requires more than just HTML markup. It also requires coordination between a view and the runtime. In this chapter, again, I don't actually like it when an author says, you will see how easy it is to... No, this stuff is not easy. If it was easy, we would have just a single book, and it would be a small book. The stuff that's in here, by and large, is quite complex. All right. Before we begin with helpers, we'll first learn about forms. Now, if you are a student, I have people who are I can't think of the word for whatever reason, but people who are part of my channel. All right, and some of these people may or may not have seen lectures I've done in other classes, but in the AWD1000 Web Technologies class, we talked quite a bit about forms. All right, you learned how to create forms in there. All right, so it says we must first learn about forms. Most of what's in here in the next section should be a lot of review to you. All right, and then finally, as it says, forms are where most of the hard work happens inside of an application and where you need HTML helpers first. Now, there's a place where I would not totally agree, but I wouldn't disagree either. And what I mean by that is when you're working with forms, yes, it can involve some of the most complex logic in an application. All right, yet it is kind of the heart of an application at the same time. So the author starts here on page 110 by going through, and says, well, why, says, you may wonder why a book targeted at web developers would cover the HTML form tag. Isn't it easy to understand? Well, I agree with what it says here. The form tag is powerful. Typically with a form tag, and again, I'm just going to write, this isn't real code or anything like that, but I would say you typically would write something like this. Form, maybe method equal post as an example, action equal, again, I'm just making this up, but maybe hello.aspx, just as an example. You'd have all of your form stuff here, and then you would end the form. Probably could make this a bit bigger. All right. And like I said, much of this should be review for most of you watching this. So this method will be post or it'll be get. We've used both those in the class here, but just so you are aware of them, the big difference between post and get is get. I have talked to classes too about database stuff, and we've talked about select, and we've talked about insert, and we've talked about create. Well, not create, insert, and we've talked about update, and we've talked about delete. When you put these things together, these 4 different commands represent the data manipulation language, or DML commands, that are associated with most databases. And you're like, well, now you're going off on databases, Jeff. Yeah, but the reason I'm mentioning that is today, usually this is referred to as CRUD. All right, and CRUD stands for create, which is basically an insert, read, which is basically a select, update, and delete. All right, so really there is a mapping here between this and this. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, if you're doing a get, the idea is the advantage of doing a get is when you use a get with something, that something you use it with can typically be bookmarked. That information that you end up sending ends up being sent in the query string. What does that mean? Again, you should know this already, but if I come through here and I look, for example, right here, was looking at a book yesterday that I'm thinking of purchasing from Manning Publications, the Quick Python book. And you notice the website here goes up to right there. It says https://www.manning.com/books/the-quick-python book-third-edition. All right. Then after that, they've got a question mark and a whole boatload of stuff in here. All right. Well, that stuff that comes in there, that stuff that comes after the question mark is referred to as a query string, and that'll hold information. Maybe the ISBN, maybe other stuff. I don't know. That's that what comes after that question mark is what you get with a get, no pun intended. So gets are designed to show you things that aren't going to change. Now, you should not put in a regular get in a query string like that things like login names, passwords, credit card numbers, etc. If you think you have to put those in at a minimum, you should go through the process where you would run them through some kind of a converter. So instead of them being clear text, they'd be in ciphertext. So you would encrypt them in some way. All right. So a get is more like a read or a select. That's typically what it's used for. On the other hand, a post typically, it infers that you are changing something. So it would be more the create or the update or the delete, or in database terms, the insert, update, or delete. All right, that is the main difference between them. The post does not add the information up in the HTTP header like we just saw with the get. Rather, I believe that what it does is it kind of buries it. All right, it doesn't show it in the query string, I should say. It doesn't show it in the HTTP query string. Rather, it kind of hides it, for lack of better words, in the HTTP header. And although it's possible to bookmark things that are done with a get, typically it is not possible to bookmark those same things that are done with a post. All right, now that's a little bit of a prelude for lack of something better. Okay, and again, I'm not saying that what I just explained to you was 100% perfect or anything else. This is the way I explain things to my classes. So they talk about the action and the method. I just showed you those. So a form is a container. That's well put. And it contains different input elements. Text boxes, check boxes, drop-down lists, buttons, etc. Even labels, typically. The input elements in a form, as it says, enable the user to enter information into a page and then submit it, where it'll typically go to a server. It says which server and how does the information get to the server. The answer to these are in two of the most important attributes of the form tag, the action and the method attributes. The action attributes tells the web browser where to send the information. We're not even talking about validation right now. All right? So the action will have a URL in it. Here's an example. What we're saying is when you go and you hit the submit button, you want to try to go to here. Oops, like that. To Bing, as an example. Now there's not a method here. Here the method is get. So again, think about this. This is where you have to start being here. Think about why you would use a get method there. You're going out to Bing and you're going to do a search. You're not changing anything. And you may want to bookmark it. All right? So it says you regularly post forms to update things or submit things that have personal information. The default is a get. So if you don't put anything in for a method, it defaults to method equal get. All right. When a user submits a form using a get request, the browser takes the input names and values and puts them in a query string. I already showed you that. All right, maybe not the best example, but I showed you an example of that. All right. To get or post, which takes up most of page 111, and believe it or not, we're already at 15 minutes, so when I get done with this, this will be the end of the first part. And the author says here, you can also give the method attribute the value post. So a method attribute can have post or it can have get. With post, as it says, it does not place the values into the input string, but inside the body of the HTTP request. Okay? Although you can successfully send a post to a search engine, a get is preferable. Unlike the post request, you can bookmark a get. You cannot bookmark, that I know of at least, the post. The get verb, as it says, is the right tool for the job because get represents a read-only operation. That's what a select in the database is. All right. So again, as it says here, you can send a GET request to a server repeatedly with no ill effects. All right. A POST, on the other hand, is the type of request you use to submit something. Credit card transaction, an album to a shopping cart. Notice we are making changes in each one of these things. That's the key takeaway here. So as mentioned, a POST generally modifies the state on the server. Many browsers help a user avoid repeating a POST request. Figure 5.1 shows what happens when you try to refresh a POST in Chrome. Maybe you've never had that happen to you, but I have. All right. Web applications generally use GET requests for reads and POST requests for writes. That's probably the easiest way of putting it. A request to pay for music uses a POST. A request to search for music uses a GET. All right. So they do mention here, it says searching for music using the search form. Let's see how long this is before I go on or I break off right here. All right, let's finish this and then we will start on the actual HTML helpers. It says, imagine you want to let your music store shoppers search for music from the home page. Just like the search engine example earlier, you need a form with an action method. So here's an example of such, the HTML shows an example that would add a simple search form. And this would be simple. Text box and a submit button. Not much more to it. It says in this section, we're using some examples based on a completed music store to illustrate. So again, it says don't worry about typing the data in because they're talking conceptually here. All right. So if you were going to do that, you would have to, if you wanted the search to work, you would have to implement a search method as is shown here on page 112. You would have to implement that on probably the home controller. All right. So you can see the code block right here. As it says, it makes the simplifying assumption that a user is always searching for music by album name. Notice how the search action expects to receive a parameter named Q, which is a string. The MVC framework automatically finds this value in the query string when the name Q is present. All right. It also finds the value in posted form values if the search is made using a POST instead of a GET. The controller tells the MVC framework then to render a view. Code for an example view which would render the results is shown here. And they've actually added some bootstrap. So this is the bottom of page 112. And going on to page 113, you've seen this before. So it would look like this. Now, what is the bootstrap they added? Well, notice they added a little bit of zebra striping. So every other line is a different color to make it a little easier to show or ascertain the difference between different rows. This scenario, as the author mentions down below it, demonstrates how easy it is to use HTML forms with ASP.NET MVC. The web browser collects the user input from the form, sends a request to the MVC application, where the MVC runtime can automatically pass the inputs into parameters for the action methods to respond to. Now this is a simple example, and the author even mentions here, not all scenarios are this easy. In fact, we've simplified the search form to the point, as it says, where it's brittle. All right. In other words, it could be written a lot better. It could be written a lot more extensively than it is. If you deploy the application to a directory that is not the root of the website, or if your route definitions change, the hard-coded value that we put in might lead the user's browser to a resource that's non-existent. Again, we've put that in there and hard-coded that in. Searching for music by calculating the action attribute value, which is the first half of page 114. Rather than hard coding it, it says here you'd be better off to calculate the value of an action. You'd be better off to hard code the form behavior. So rather than hard coding it, the better way would be to calculate the value of the action attribute. All right? Think of it this way, and this analogy just came to mind. Maybe it's not a good one, but I don't know. All right, let's suppose that I'm going to travel from Wentzville, Missouri, where I'm located right now, to St. Louis, Missouri, which is about a 40-mile drive. All right, so let's imagine that when I do that, what I do is rather than using a GPS or whatever, I just literally go out and I do this. So I type in as an example. Okay, I think this is worthwhile. Hopefully you will as well. But I'm going to put in here driving directions from 751 Parr Road, Wentzville, Missouri, which is where I am right now, to, I always forget the address of the St. Louis campus. And there it is. So let's say that I type this in. So driving directions from 751 Parr Road, Wentzville, Missouri to 4431 Finney Avenue, St. Louis, Missouri, 63113. So I put that in. Boom. It gives me this. It says it's just about 40 miles, and it's suggesting that I take either I-70, which is a little faster, and if I don't want to take that, if I want to go three minutes later, I can take I-64. Okay, fine. All right, but that is supposing that I won't have to change my route, that there's not an accident, there's not a backup, there's not anything else. On the other hand, if instead of typing that in, I go in and actually use a GPS and I have a problem, I'm not hard coding the behavior in. I'm putting in something, but I might be able to change it on the fly. That's kind of what they're talking about here. All right. So the author is saying in this case, with this begin form, all right, it says the begin form helper asks the routing engine how to reach the search portion of the controller. Behind the scenes, it uses a method named getVirtualPath on the routes property that's exposed by the routes table. It says if you did all this without an HTML helper, you'd have to go in and make changes like this, right here. It says here, this example demonstrates the essence of what an HTML helper is. They don't take away your control, but they save you from writing code. So before we get into looking at HTML helpers in detail, let's finish up here with part 1 of chapter 5. We'll pick it up with part 2 in just a couple minutes.